Hello and welcome. Now in this video, I'm going to demystify some concepts around the controller class and how it ties in to character movement and the movement component. So we're going to start with talking about the controller class. Now I want you to think for a moment about the character and how the character has a capsule component as well as this strange little arrow that you can see when you open up the blueprint editor. That's an arrow component. Now, the arrow component simply shows you which direction is forward, and the capsule component is used for most types of collision. It's what determines whether the character is colliding with the floor, for instance. It's also what prevents the character from moving through walls. It's the capsule that actually collides with objects in the world, because if most objects collided with the mesh itself, this would require too many calculations to detect those collisions. Now, why don't we consider some of these things on the character for a moment? The capsule component is invisible in the game. Sure, you can set it to be visible, but typically you don't want to see it. So it's an entity that exists on the character that you cannot see. Likewise, the arrow component is also invisible. When we play the game, this is what we typically see. And the end user, the person playing the game, usually has no idea that a capsule or an arrow component even exist on the character. Now, the controller class is sort of like that. The controller is also invisible. You can think of it as this invisible entity following the character around, but it doesn't have its own scale or location. It's just a C++ class object associated with the character. Now, even though it doesn't have its own location per se, it does have an orientation, that is to say, a rotation, and there are functions to get and set the controller rotation. Now, that being said, there is no function to get its forward vector or right vector or up vector. It doesn't have those variables. It only has a rotation. However, if we know its rotation, we can perform some calculations to get a vector that points in a direction that corresponds to the controller's orientation. So what role does a controller play? This is where we get into possession. When a controller possesses a character, it controls how that character moves. So why don't we follow the flow of information starting at the user? The user provides input to the game via devices like the mouse and the keyboard. This input information is then passed to the controller. Now, the controller takes that information and uses that data to move the character, but first it passes it over to the movement component. Now, the movement component takes that input data and performs calculations and makes sure that before the character is moved, it's moved in the right ways. It has to obey laws such as gravity. It cannot move the character through walls or other objects that are meant to collide with the character. So the movement component is necessary to make sure that we're not moving the character in any illegal ways. But once those calculations are performed, then the movement component can move the character. The movement component contains variables such as the maximum walk speed for a character. So this is the flow of information from user to character. Now let's dive into the engine and program some movement functionality for our character.